Good evening. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce our tonight's speaker, William U.Uwolfort. He's the Daniel Webster Professor at Dartmouth College, one of the Ivy League universities in the United States. Professor U.Uwolfort received his MA and his PhD from Yale University, but I just learned very recently that he was in the same group as Celeste Wallander, who is now responsible for Russia in the National Security Council in the United States. He is particularly famous in this country for his quite strong argument about unipolarity and the stability of the unipolar world order. I can't say everyone in this country agreed with that argument, but at any rate, it was a famous proposition which encouraged a lot of response on the part of our scholars. Professor U.Uwolfort has authored and co-authored and edited numerous books, articles, and collective volumes, and his research revolves around not only international relations theory, of which I'm sure you're well aware as students of this university, because he's one of the founding authors and one of the most prominent representatives of neoclassical realism, the school of thought which has had a profound impact on the American foreign policy strategy, but he also did a lot of historical work, and his topics that he addressed range from the Cold War history to Russian-American relations. So he's blending together the theoretical and practical approach. And there's a bit which I like most. When I introduced Professor U.Uwolfort, I did it, I think, twice on his previous visits to MGIMOs. His impeccable reputation in the academic world, because he belongs to the cohort of one of the most quoted international relations scholars in the world. I think he tops the list of 5 most quoted IR specialists in the world, along with Robert Cohen, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and John Eikenberry, with an H index of 14. Believe me, it is unbelievably high. So please join me in welcoming Professor William U.Uwolfort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre, and it is a great pleasure to be back here at MGIMO University, and I want to express particular thanks to you, Andre, for your role in bringing me here. I have been studying international relations for most of my life, since I was 18 years old, and as a longtime student of the subject of international relations, it's a particular pleasure to be at one of the finest institutions in the world for the study of international relations, and to get to share some of my research with you tonight. So I'm very excited to be here. I very much look forward to making these remarks to you. I hope to confine my remarks to 45 minutes or so. Scientific research has shown decisively that any speech much longer than 45 minutes and people's minds start to wander. And when they're young people, their minds wander to one or both of 2 subjects. One is food, and the other one I'm not going to mention, but I think you can imagine what it is. And because of that, I'm going to be careful to keep my remarks within a reasonable amount of time. So I start my remarks to you on the subject of the United States' global role in the 21st century with an image from a book that was published by my Yale advisor. My advisor from Yale University, one of them, was Paul Kennedy. He wrote a book, The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers, which was published in 1987, and it became a bestseller. And the cover of that book, the original cover, which I have here on this slide, captures the mood of the 1980s. We see a weary Uncle Sam, representing the United States, no longer able to carry the burden of its foreign policy. Long past the apex of global power is Great Britain, and look who is rising up to take the top of the world. It's Japan. And so there's a lot of lessons one can take away from this, but the one I mainly want to focus on is kind of how much has changed. Because now the conversation is about another potential power transition or change in the leadership of the international system, from the position of Japan is now occupied by China. And we see lots of discussions about a post-American world and many discussions about China as the next superpower. And this comes at a time when there's a lot of pressure on American foreign policy. Don't worry about the statistics that I'm showing here. They boil down to a fundamental problem the United States faces, which is it's facing strain on its state budget, and the biggest piece of the state budget that it can easily cut is actually military spending. The social programs and other things that the U.S. spends money on are politically much harder to cut. The result is pressure on American foreign policy. And that pressure of this expansive grand strategy of the United States, that pressure is not just measured in terms of budgetary problems, but also public opinion. We see increasing numbers, proportions of the American electorate expressing views suggesting that it is hungry for a smaller role in the world. And as you can see here, there's a question that has been asked of Americans since 1964, whether the U.S. should mind its own business internationally and let other countries fend for themselves. And you will see there that after the financial crisis of 2008, for the first time in 50 years, more Americans answered yes to that question than answered no. I have also on this slide the results from my own international relations introductory class at Dartmouth College. And as you can see, when it comes to Ivy League students, fewer people support this proposition. But the Americans as a whole are increasingly suggesting, calling into question this foreign policy of being globally engaged. The United States has really followed, more or less, since the dawn of the Cold War. And look at this data. Again, the left-hand side of that graph is simply showing you those Americans who answer this question by saying that the United States is unable to afford all of its global commitments. And finally, we see data coming from the public that says that America's allies really are kind of getting a good deal from their relationship and not paying their fair share. They're essentially free riding or exploiting their relationship with the United States to spend less on their own defense while the United States carries the burden. All of those statistics and data are simply adding up to two challenges, two potential changes in the international system, changes that would alter the global world order. Will the United States continue to be a superpower, or will it decline and be replaced or supplanted by another state? And the second question is, will the United States continue to pursue its very active, globally engaged foreign policy? Now, there's a lot of discussion both in Russia and elsewhere in academic circles, but also in the world of policy, about the stability of the world order and change in the world order. And you'll hear a lot of talk about how the world order is undergoing stress or change. My proposition to you is that those two features, the U.S. as a superpower and the U.S. as a globally engaged power, are two underlying buttresses or foundations of the current world order. I'm not saying whether they're good or bad, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not saying whether I like them or I hate them. I'm simply saying they are fundamental realities that have characterized world politics since 1950 and especially since 1990. One superpower, globally engaged superpower. And I suggest to you if either or both of those two things were to change, you would see a dramatic change in the nature of world politics. So that really gives you the fundamental roadmap or outline for the rest of my remarks to you today, which is I'm going to argue that essentially commentators, policymakers, scholars are overestimating the likelihood that either of these two basic pillars of the current international system are going to change dramatically. Now, I'm not saying that there's no change. On the contrary, I'm going to tell you there are substantial changes, and they're going to result in changes in American foreign policy. but I am suggesting that the way people describe this change, the words and language they use to describe this change, overestimates its potential to alter the nature of world politics. So that's basically where I'm going. I'm going to start with giving you one argument for how we should think about this question of change, which is to think of the world as a 1 + 1 + X world, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then I'm going to say very briefly why I think this basic world, 1 + 1 + X, will probably characterize the world for several more decades to come. And then I'm going to look at why I think the United States is not going to dramatically sever its connections and its alliances and pull back to a more isolationist posture in international politics. Okay, so that's where I'm going. Are you ready? All right, great. All right, so let me start with looking at my actual notes here, so I know what I'm saying. Ah, yes. So let me say a few words about how to think about the international system. There's a lot of words people throw around to discuss the basic structure of the international system. I plead guilty to having written a lot about something called unipolarity. And we hear many people saying, no, 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 the world is not unipolar, it's really multipolar. Or maybe it's bipolar. Despite the fact that I wrote a lot about unipolarity, I'm going to suggest today that we stop thinking about it that way and suggest a different way of thinking about it, a simpler way of thinking about it. Let us say we call the world that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, let's say we call that world a world of one superpower, a one superpower world. We all know what a superpower is. A superpower is a country that can operate militarily and politically all around the world, a country that can make security guarantees, that is to say, make military alliances with faraway partners and make them credible in multiple regions across oceans. That's what a superpower is. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the world had one superpower. And the world order that we see today is partly the result of this fact. The world had one superpower. The question then is, how long will that last? Are there other countries that can either become superpowers themselves or prevent the United States from being a superpower? That's the question to ask. And I think if you look out across the world, and I know this is going to be a very unpopular thing I'm about to say, maybe it will be, I don't know, I only see one country that has the potential to be more than just a regular old great power, but become a superpower. And that country is China. That is the country everybody's talking about, ladies and gentlemen. That is the country that seems to be rising. That is the country whose economy, by some measures, has either already caught up to or is about to catch up to or has already surpassed the United States. That's the country. The eyes of the world are upon it. If you were to poll international relations experts that I know, they would all put China in a class by itself as a potential superpower. All other great powers, Russia, India, Brazil, France, Germany, etc., all the rest of them are great powers for sure. They're just not like any other country. They're big and important countries. But none of them, aside from China, seems to have the potential to either become a superpower itself, as I've defined that terms, or to prevent the United States from acting as a superpower. Therefore, if we're going to go from a one superpower world to a many superpower world, or from a one superpower world to a no superpower world, it's going to be China that's going to do it. Does that make sense? So let me say a little bit more about that as we go on. So that's why what I just mentioned is why I'm calling this a 1 + 1 + X. There's one superpower, the United States. There's one potential superpower, China. And there's X number of great powers. And we can argue about who belongs in this X club. Is Brazil? Is India? Is Britain really still in the club? And we can debate that. But fundamentally, you can add India, you can subtract Brazil, and it really doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the structure of world politics. What matters is that first number. Is it 0, no superpowers, or is it 1, or is it more than 1? So that's the way I'm suggesting we think about the structure of the international system. And now I want to take a few minutes to say why I think it's going to stay a 1 + 1 + X world for many more decades. So let's unpack, let's take a look at the components that underline the position of a superpower. Well, obviously, there is military primacy. That is to say, having a lot of military power. But it's much more than just military power. It involves the alliance relationships and the military capacity to sustain these military commitments across oceans to allies and partners in many, many countries. So this is the way the Pentagon, the nefarious, evil Pentagon, views the world. It looks at the world in terms of command: European Command, Central Command, Africa, South Command. And all of them, for most of them, the U.S. has the capacity to bring to bear political, military power to sustain these complicated alliances. And as all of you know, the United States has a lot of allies and partners in the world. It has 23 NATO allies. Technically, the U.S. has security alliances with the Organization of American States. That's another 33. Then it has 15 countries that it calls major non-NATO allies. That's countries such as Israel, Pakistan, Pakistan, and other countries. And then it has at least, by my count, 7 other de facto security commitments. So that's a lot of allies. No other country maintains a portfolio of security allies, anything like this. The only way you can do this, sorry for the propaganda picture, folks, but you have to show pictures, otherwise people get bored these days. This is, of course, a U.S. carrier battle group, otherwise known in China as a target. But it is giving you a sense of the capacity to move forces around the world to sustain those alliances that I mentioned. You need to command the commons, or at least prevent anyone else from stopping your use of the commons. And by commons, we mean the non-territorial sea, air, and of course, space. It's not that Russia and China don't have any presence in these areas. It's that they can't stop the United States from using them to move military forces anywhere around the world. So now again, to go repeat the slide, the question is China rising to the point where it will prevent the U.S. from acting as a superpower or replace the United States as a superpower? And before I should continue, I should say I've given a similar talk to this in China, and most of my Chinese colleagues say, what are you talking about? I mean, of course not. We have no interest in becoming a superpower. So I recognize that. The question isn't what China today may aspire to. The question is, over the long term, what might it be capable of? That's what, for those of you who've studied international relations theory, that's what realist theory points us to. Underlying capabilities. All right, right. Getting back to the notes, very good, excellent, fabulous. All right, so what's going on? Well, things are changing, and I want you all to be aware that I'm fully aware of this, and in fact, the change is very important, but I argue not changing in such a way as to undermine the 1 + 1 + X nature of the world. I'm sorry for putting up all of these graphs and charts, but they help capture the measurements and arguments that I'm talking about. What this shows is basically 2 different measures of economic size, so-called purchasing power parity and market exchange rate measures, from the IMF, looking from 1995 to 2008. And essentially it's measuring basically the United States alone by both measures, the United States and all of its allies, and China. And the big takeaway from this that it shows you is that yes, China is definitely rising. By all measures, China as a share of the global economy is rising. And most dramatically, the share of the global economy made up of by the United States and all of its allies, by which I mean NATO, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Israel, et cetera, at the beginning of the post-Cold War era, we were looking at anywhere between 65% and 80% of the global economy was made up of the U.S. and its allies. That has declined precipitously to somewhere between 40% and 65%. That is telling you there is a big change out there. However, the U.S. itself, its position in the global economy as a share of the global economy, is relatively constant, hovering around a quarter between 1965 and today. It's roughly varied between 23 and 30% and back down. So that's telling you that the world is changing, and it's in terms, if we think of it in terms of economic capability, but that it is in some ways not changing. If anything, if you were to look at that chart, you'd think we're heading towards bipolarity. That is to say, the U.S. allies are declining, the U.S. is holding steady, and China is rising. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we think that economic GDP is the same as power, because we know it isn't. And that's really the thrust of the rest of my remarks on this first part of my talk about the 1 + 1 + X world. And that is that although the Chinese economy has risen dramatically, it's slowed down a little recently, but still it's growing very quickly. Even though the Chinese economy is rising and really attracting people's attention, really capturing people's imaginations, translating economic capability into political power, military and other, is a much slower process. In fact, I will argue to you, it's slower and harder to do now than it was in the past. And let me just walk through that a little bit very quickly. Basically what you get, one way to think about an increasing size of your economy is that's an input. It's a resource. It's an input. What matters, of course, is outputs. Now we see here on the technology side, so technology being a very important part of capability. On the technology side, we see dramatic increases in Chinese inputs into its tech. They're investing more and more in their technological capabilities. But there is a huge lag between making the investments and reaping the outputs. And this is another complicated chart. So it's just 4 measures of technological output: Nobel Prizes, patents for which you are patents that are recognized in the EU, Japan, and the United States, so-called triadic patents, receipts of royalty and licensing fees, that's on innovation, and a top 1% cited science and engineering articles. On all of these outputs, China does not even show up. It will take a long time to translate these inputs into those outputs. How long? I would suggest, at least historical experience suggests, decades. This is also true on military capability. China is dramatically increasing its military spending because its economy is growing quickly. It's easy for China to raise defense spending. It just raises defense spending as its economy grows. And that has resulted in the dotted line below. You can see a narrowing gap between the United States and China. But that is capturing, for those of you who study economics, that is capturing an annual flow. It's an annual flow of expenditure. Another way to think about that, though, is as a stock. That is to say, flows over years, over decades, create stocks that are hard to replicate. So one way to look at these charts is essentially to think of the difference between how much China has spent and how much the United States has spent in each year, and then add that up. And ask yourself what that sum amounts to over a period of decades. And the answer is a dramatic stock of U.S. military assets. And this comes through in another one of these crazy charts, which is essentially measuring the percentage that each great power has of the components, the requisites of command of the commons, as identified by the MIT political scientist Barry Posen in his study of the command of the commons. And basically this is looking at a percentage distribution, so it's like a pie chart, and who has how much of the pie. And again, you see, China hardly shows up. Indeed, if you're looking at this chart, it's clear Russia is the country that has the most significant military capability to command the commons. Why? Partly because it's invested in it, but partly because of exactly what I'm talking about. Partly because Russia inherited the military-industrial complex of a superpower that was built up over decades. Now, of course, it has been nurtured by Russia over the years, but if it didn't start in 1991 with that inherited capacity, it would not show up on this chart the way it does. And that's telling you that China has a very, very long way to go to get from its inputs to achieve the military outputs. Okay, so all of this adds up to an argument that I'm happy to entertain in at further length, but I'm going to move away from it quickly, namely that this power transition is different than other power transitions that we have studied, different than those that my Yale mentor Paul Kennedy studied in his book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It's different for two big reasons. First, the rising state, in this case China, is at a much lower developmental and technological level than the reigning dominant state. If you look at these other power transitions, the US as it rose vis-a-vis Britain, Germany as it rose vis-a-vis Britain and the US, and the Soviet Union as it rose vis-a-vis Britain and the US, and Japan as it rose in the late 20th century, all of them were essentially on the same technological level and at a much closer overall developmental level to the reigning dominant state than China is today. So that's the first reason, that this power transition will take longer than you think. And the second one, though, is less often commented upon, and that is that the ability to translate basic economic capacity into military capacity is much harder now than it used to be, because weapons and military systems have a much higher technological, institutional level. It's much harder to replicate these weapons. If you think back to what it took to be a superpower in 1950 or 1975, and then look at the technological requirements today, the lag time between the investment and the output is much greater today than it used to be. We can talk more about it if you're interested, but that's my fundamental argument. It will take China a very, very long time, if we assume that it continues to grow rapidly, to be in a position either to prevent the US from being a superpower, or to supplant the US as the world's only superpower, or join the United States as a superpower. That means we are in a 1 + 1 + X world for a very, very long time to come. My guess is your professional careers, at least the first big chunk of your professional careers, you'll be in this basic world. Not saying it's not changing, as I'm about to suggest, but you'll be in this basic world. All right. So that leads us back to our outline about where the talk is going, and it leads, of course, in some sense, to the most interesting question, which is policy choice. What is the United States likely to do in this new world? Again, I want to stress, I'm arguing to you what I think it will probably do, not what I wish it would do, what I think it should do, but what I think it probably will do. There's a distinction between what I want the world to be like and what the world actually is like. One of my favorite colleagues at Princeton was named Robert Gilpin. I don't know if you've ever heard of Robert Gilpin. He's a great realist scholar of international relations, and people used to ask him, Bob, what is your political theory? What is your approach to international relations? He said, I'm a liberal. It's just that the world is realist. And so what choice do we have? So that's how I approach the question of America's grand strategic choice. And I'm going to move through this rapidly, but because I know some of you are thinking about food or other things. And so I'm going to move quickly, and but give you a sense of what I think the debate is, where the debate is now, and where I think it's likely to end up. Okay? Okay. 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes. Maximum. Okay, so first we have to say, what is the core, what is the essence, what is the fundamental basis of the foreign policy, or in a larger sense, the grand strategy that the United States has followed really since 1950, but let's just say since the end of the Cold War. It's basically got these three objectives that I have up here, which is manage the external environment, to reduce near and long-term threats to U.S. national security. That's a polite way of saying it wants power. It wants power. It likes to control stuff so that it can prevent bad things from coming to get it. This is standard great power behavior. The difference for the United States, though, is the United States has something that no other great power has. It has dominance in its own region. There's no other great power in America. So the U.S. is so secure in its homeland, it gets to go abroad and try to shape the environment abroad, to make the environment abroad as conducive or congenial to it as possible. If you look at every war the U.S. has fought, except the Civil War, and of course the Revolutionary and the war in 1812, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, they're all wars fought abroad. They're all wars fought by choice. All of them were by choice. You know, people say Iraq was a war of choice. Well, so was every other war the United States fought since the Civil War. It was always a war of choice. It chooses to go out in the world and shape the environment in the way that it wants. And my argument is, in doing so, it is doing exactly what any other great power would do in its position. The second one is, of course, not just does it doesn't only want security, it also wants to be rich. It wants to have lots of wealth. And the way Americans think of this is it wants to promote an open, congenial, liberal, so-called liberal economic order. That is an order that's open to trading, open globalization order. And that's to expand its own prosperity. It does this for itself. You'll note here, I'm never talking about the U.S. doing anything for the world. The U.S. does things for itself. Some people like it, some people don't. That's the way it goes. And finally, it does follow a strategy of it likes international institutions, but as you all know, it only likes international institutions that it can powerfully influence. It doesn't like international institutions, by and large, that it doesn't have strong influence. And there's a few exceptions to that, like the WTO, where it really only has it subjects itself to external constraints. I can explain why it does that, why that is an exception that proves the rule. But by and large, it likes institutions because institutions are very, like international law, the UN, the WTO, the IMF, all of these institutions are very useful for managing global problems that the United States can't solve on its own. It needs partners, and it likes institutions. But as you all know, it likes institutions that it influences strongly. It doesn't like institutions that is just one state, one vote. It likes the Security Council better than the General Assembly, for example, in the UN. Okay. And what makes all three of those objectives possible, or at least makes them more likely to be achieved by Washington, is these security guarantees the United States gives to its allies and its partners, because it uses those security guarantees for leverage, to get partners and allies and supporters, to get influence in the world. It also uses those alliances to do the first objective, which is to manage the external environment, to keep problems away from itself, to keep the world the way it likes. Okay, so that's American, that's the core grand strategy. That's the core of it. Of course, it does a lot of other things, but that's what I would call the core. All right, one more highly wordy slide. Here's the basic options, and here's the debate. Basically, you have an option of the core that I've just described is not enough. This is what I call core plus, or liberal hegemony type arguments. This is the argument that it's not enough for us to sustain these alliances. We have to go out and transform the world and make it a better place. We have to go bring democracy to new countries. We have to fight for our values. Now, there's two kinds of arguments for this, both positive arguments and normative. Positive argument is the type of argument that says, we need to do this to make ourselves more secure. The normative argument is a right and wrong type argument. That says, I don't care whether it's good for us or not. We need to do this because that's who we are as Americans. We bring democracy. We spread democracy. Then there's the core, which is what I would call status quo deep engagement. That's a strategy that I've just described to you on the previous slide, that looks at the world and says, you know what? This world is basically pretty good for us in the United States. We should seek to basically keep it this way as much as possible. Of course, we'll make some adjustments. Of course, we'll make some deals. We'll make some bargains. We'll make some concessions. But at the end of the day, we like this world. Threats are very far away. We're the only superpower. I like this world. Let's keep it that way. Therefore, it would be a status quo. Unlike the core plus, no need to spread your alliances. No need to bring on new allies. No need to spread your values. Hold on to what you have. And the final option is what I would call core minus, and that is what a lot of my colleagues in international relations favor, and that is get rid of the whole damn thing. Cut loose these allies, end NATO, end the Japanese alliance, end the alliance with Korea, end the alliance with Taiwan, bring all of our troops home, and get out of the business of being a global superpower altogether. Of course, keep a very powerful military capability home in the United States, but just get rid of these allies that do nothing but drain American power, drag America into conflicts, and create problems for us. So those are the three options. Now, the key point is, in Washington, D.C., the debate is totally about core plus versus core. That's what the debate in Washington is. To give you an example close to home, let's take Ukraine. The debate is over, should the United States assume some obligation for Ukraine or not? That's a core plus versus core debate. A core argument would say, we don't need to add any allies. We've got NATO, let's preserve that. The core plus argument is, oh no, we are obligated to defend Ukraine. Or we do it because that's just who we are, or we do it because we have some interest. What that interest is, frankly, I have no idea, but we have some interest in spreading our alliance to Ukraine. So the debate in Washington is core, core plus. The debate among academic scholars is core, core minus. It's basically, my debate with my colleagues is all about, should we retrench? So that's the basic set of debates. Now let me take a few more minutes to sort of walk you through and say why I think systemic pressures are pushing the United States away from core plus but back to core, but very unlikely to push the United States to full-scale retrenchment of the type favored by many realist scholars. And the basic argument, I think, is also consistent with realism. So this is a kind of debate between realist theory. Okay, where are we here? Maybe the view is to not look at my notes. That way, I'll get through much faster. Okay, so the main argument. Let me walk you through these arguments very quickly by starting with the argument of people who say we should go to core minus. People like John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, Barry Posen, Christopher Lane, Randy Schweller. The list goes on and on. These are realist scholars, but increasingly, as I showed you in those first slides, their arguments are starting to resonate with certain sectors of the population. Their main argument is that the current strategy of really core plus is too expensive, too costly, too dangerous, too risky, and is completely not in the American national interest anymore. They make many, many arguments. One of them is the so-called free rider argument that I already mentioned. This graph just shows you defense spending as a percent of GDP in the United States and its chief NATO allies and Japan. And what you see, of course, is dramatic declines in the commitment of America's allies to defense. And the argument simply is, as long as Uncle Sam, or as John Mearsheimer likes to call it, Uncle Sugar, as long as Uncle Sugar is paying for defense, why should we invest in defense? And so the argument is, if the United States were to retrench and pull back, these states would pick up the burden and would spend more on their own defense. And we would end up saving all of that money, which we could use to maybe build some nice infrastructure like you have here in Moscow. You know, maybe we could have a decent highway system. Maybe we could fix some of our bridges. Maybe we could have a nice metro. We can, according to these guys, as long as we're spending all this money defending Japan. Why are we defending Japan? It's a rich country. Why are we defending Germany? It's a rich country. That's the first argument. The second argument they have is balance of power theory. If you go around the world putting up military bases and having allies, you're going to make other countries mad, and they will balance. This is the standard argument of realist balance of power theory. So these guys argue that the U.S. strategy simply makes enemies for itself. If we pull back, the U.S. would actually have fewer geopolitical rivals than it does now, because China and Russia would no longer be looking at the United States. Guess who they'd be looking at? Each other. At least that's the standard realist view. The only really thing geopolitically that brings China and Russia together is the U.S. If we back away, they'll be at each other's throats, and things will be great for the United States. And the next argument is the old saying, I don't know if you have this in Russian, my Russian is terrible, so I wouldn't know it if you did, that there's an old saying, at least in the English language, that if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And the argument is, this is the argument of temptation. Namely, if the U.S. maintains this superpower capacity to intervene all around the world, it's going to be tempted to do so. It's going to be tempted to use its military because it has the capacity to. And this is the argument that says that what happened after 9/11, what happened after September 11th, 2001, was exactly this. We were attacked by terrorists, but we had this gigantic global military capacity, and the result was this highly adventurous policy of George W. Bush of going and remaking the Middle East at the point of a gun. U.S. would only conceive of such a policy if it already had this gigantic potential. Get rid of the potential, and like Ulysses being tied to the mast of the ship, you will not be able to succumb to temptation, and you will not get involved in very expensive, dangerous, and bad wars. So that's another argument of these guys for why we should adopt a strategy of retrenchment, why the U.S. should pull back from the world. But there are some problems with that case. There's a lot up there, but I'll move through it briskly. There's a problem with that case. One thing is, I think objectively the critics are overstating the cost. Why? Because they are only assessing the costs of the core plus strategy, not the core. In other words, much of the dangers, many of the problems they identify are the result of essentially the strategy that George Bush followed after 9/11. I ask you in your minds to replay the clock. Ask yourself, what would have happened if after 9/11 the United States adopted a more modest policy in the world? The United States did not invade Iraq. You rewind that clock. If the United States had focused only on the core of its grand strategy and not tried to rebuild the Middle East, would we even having this conversation today about the overstretched superpower? Probably not. But the main, I think, reason why the case for a strategy of coming home or isolationism is weaker than its proponents think is because they fail to assess the benefits. And again, like a good realist, I assume if the net benefits exceed the costs, the state is likely to continue with the strategy. And so let me just quickly walk you through, but you can already see what's on the screen, and it's more or less self-explanatory. First of all, if the United States severs all of its alliances, it's very likely to speed the rise of other powers. In other words, the U.S., as I said a while back, is engaged in these alliances partly because it wants to prevent any other great power from doing what it did, which is become so dominant in its region that it can start focusing on other regions, like America. And so if the U.S. were to abrogate NATO, dissolve NATO, dissolve the Japan alliance, dissolve the Taiwan alliance, dissolve the South Korea alliance, dissolve the alliance with Australia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what would happen? It's quite likely that the path of China towards becoming a greater power in its region would be much shorter than it is now. The constraints on China would go down. And therefore, it would speed the rise of other powers. So that's one of the arguments. That's a classic axiom of American grand strategy, is stay engaged to prevent the rise of another major power, at least as a hedge, at least as a potential investment that may become necessary later on. But there's a bunch of other arguments that are used, and I think there's some support for these arguments. I think there's some support for these, namely that overall, if the U.S. were to get rid of all of its alliances, there's a good bet that the world, overall, the security situation in the world would decline. You're not going to like that, I'm pretty sure, but I think there's some good reasons to think that there would be more arms races, more tension, more crises in a world with no U.S. security guarantees than in the current world with security guarantees. You may, I don't know whether you study this in your classes, but in reality, the current world is, in terms of security, is pretty good by most measures. If you look at the amount great powers spend on their defense, it's dramatically down from the Cold War at a fairly reasonable average of about 2.5% of GDP. So that doesn't tell you that the numbers of military outlays doesn't show you a world with a lot of major security problems. Otherwise, you'd see defense spending going up. War overall, the amount of armed conflict, is declining since the Cold War. It's not declining right now, mainly because of Syria, but it's overall declined since the Cold War days. I'm not saying that the only reason this decline is because of U.S. security guarantees. What I'm suggesting is, were the U.S. to abrogate its alliances, my money is on the prediction that the security competition would increase, in particular in East Asia. Because the question has to be asked, what does Japan do the day after the United States tells Japan it's no longer going to defend Japan? Well, Japan will almost certainly build up its own military. It's very unlikely that it's going to sit there at 1% of GDP. And the result will be, I think, possibly a very negative reaction in Beijing and a potential spiral of competition between China and Japan. What will happen in the Middle East if the United States gets rid of all alliances? I know a lot of you would say, oh, it would be great. Get them out. But ask yourself for a second, what does Israel do the day after we tell them, we're no longer your ally? What does Egypt do? What does Turkey do? What does Saudi Arabia do? What does Jordan do? What do the Gulf states do? Do they suddenly say, oh, well, America's security guarantee is gone, we'll just live happily and peacefully together? Or will they decide they need to build more capability, particularly nuclear capability? My bet is on the second option, resulting in the Middle East even worse than it is now. Yes, yes, I know, the United States created ISIS, it's all our fault. But that aside, the other benefit the U.S. gets, and the cost it would endure if it suddenly, or even not suddenly, got rid of its alliances, would be the problem of proliferation, nuclear proliferation. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union worked hard on preventing proliferation, but we all expected there to be a lot more nuclear powers than there are today. One big reason why there aren't more is the U.S. security guarantees. We basically seek to buy off countries from developing their own nuclear weapons by helping them provide for their security. And we have lots of documentary evidence now from Cold War history showing how the U.S. used its security alliances to reassure states so that they wouldn't go nuclear. Best example is Korea, which twice seriously considered nuclear weapons option, but also Taiwan. In each case, the U.S. shut it down. Moreover, when a U.S. ally thinks about proliferating itself, the U.S. security alliance helps to limit the transfer of nuclear materials by U.S. allies. So on balance, if you pull out those security guarantees, I'm expecting to see more proliferation and potential cascades of nuclear proliferation, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. If the world gets more tense, if I'm right that a world unsecured by the United States would be more rife with military competition, the results could feed into adverse effects on globalization. It's at least a possibility. Free trade and liberal economics likes peace. It doesn't like war. It doesn't like security competition. Finally, the United States is going to get a lot less security cooperation if it ceases to have these partnerships that it draws on for security cooperation. In addition, the United States gets, in many cases, pure economic benefits from its alliances. It can sometimes use its alliances to get its alliance partners to support the U.S. position in economic negotiations. Indeed, many of you will have heard that the global reserve currency is the United States dollar. Most economists who study the history of reserve currencies or global currencies see a connection between the international security role of the reserve currency power and the economic role of their currency. So in some sense, there is a link. It's not the only link, but there is a link between the U.S. dollar's role as a reserve currency and the U.S. security role as a provider of security for its alliances. So I am rushing here because I want to move to the question and answer, but I'll conclude by suggesting that if you look carefully at both the cost and the benefits of a globally engaged grand strategy, overall, it looks like the United States gets too many benefits at too low a cost for me to predict that there's any likelihood the United States is going to severely pull back from the world. However, having said that, I think the most likely trend you are going to see, indeed, you're already seeing it, is for the United States to pull back from the core plus liberal hegemony and focus on the core. Focus on those basic security commitments, not necessarily expanding them. And why is that? Well, it's because of all the things that are changing and frankly, partly it's a rising, more capable, more assertive Russia. Russia is a state that's much more capable than it used to be. But even more, it's the rise of China and the difficulty and the expense the U.S. is going to have to try to sustain its commitments in East Asia. It's just getting harder. It's getting more expensive. And so the U.S. ability to pursue the core and something else, plus it's getting the opportunity cost of pursuing the core strategy plus other things is going up. So if the U.S. is a rational actor, okay, that's a big assumption. If the U.S. is a rational actor, it is likely progressively to begin to focus on sustaining the core. And indeed, if you look at the second administration of Barack Obama, overall, that's what the conversation in Washington is about. The president seems to be wanting to focus back on the core, and he's constantly being criticized by liberal hegemonists who want to continue to sustain core plus. My prediction, based on my reading of global trends, is that the core debate will win out over the core plus debate. Here, perhaps, I am allowing my own hopes to affect my academic predictions, but I stand by my scholarly forecast. And with that, I'll bring my remarks to a close, and thank you very much for your attention.